Before we begin, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. There's new content every week that will blow your mind. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I want to know which city or country is following this story. The walls were too high for an ordinary house, made of weathered concrete covered in ivy that seemed to grow faster than usual. They surrounded the property as if trying to contain something or prevent something from escaping. The mansion stood in the center of the plot, white, imposing, with tall, symmetrical windows that reflected the grey late autumn sky. From the outside, everything seemed quiet and full of wealth. Inside, nobody knew. Clara Bennett parked her rental car in front of the electronic gate and observed the construction site with professional attention. A freelance investigative photographer, she made a living documenting what people preferred to keep hidden: violent evictions, hospital negligence, corporate corruption. But this assignment was different. There was no formal complaint. There was no legal process, just rumors about Whitmore Mansion. The property had belonged to the Whitmore family for 3 generations. Longtime investors in real estate and infrastructure, the Whitmores had political influence and an impeccable public reputation. They donated millions to hospitals, sponsored educational campaigns, and appeared at charity events with perfectly practiced smiles. But in the last 5 years, almost no one has seen them. And yet, cars were still entering and leaving the property during the early hours of the morning. Clara raised her camera and photographed the walls. Across the street, an elderly neighbor peered through the curtains. The street was wide and tree-lined, typical of old neighborhoods on the American East Coast. Colonial houses, manicured gardens, flags fluttering on porches. Everything is too normal. The story reached Clara through an anonymous source who sent only 3 things: a blurry photo of a stretcher being carried into the mansion at 2 in the morning, a list of crossed-out names, and a single sentence: "They never leave through the front gate." Clara didn't believe in fantasies. She didn't believe in supernatural conspiracies. It was a realistic story. It had to be. There was always a rational explanation. But people were disappearing in the region. Young adults, mostly temporary workers, gardeners, delivery drivers, cleaning assistants, people without strong ties, without close family, they disappeared, and the police classified it as a voluntary escape. Clara got out of the car as the gate slowly opened. The invitation to register the family's social project had arrived days earlier, after she sent a generic email requesting access for an article about local philanthropy. The response had been too quick. As if they were waiting. The front door opened before she could knock. The man who appeared was tall, with a rigid posture, wearing an impeccable dark suit. His grey hair was combed back. Elliot Whitmore, the heir. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice firm and neutral. "Welcome." She squeezed his hand, coldly. "Thank you for the invitation." He didn't smile. Inside the mansion, the air felt heavy. There was no smell of mold or neglect. Everything was too clean, too polished. Gleaming marble floors, an imposing central staircase, classic paintings on the walls, but no family photos, no portrait, no visible memory. Clara walked around while photographing architectural details. She discreetly observed side corridors, closed doors, and almost invisible embedded security cameras. "We believe in discretion," Elliot said, noticing her gaze. "Discretion is different from isolation," she replied matter-of-factly. He led her through spacious halls, the library, the dining room, and the inner gardens, always accompanied, always present, no visible staff. "How many people currently work here?" Clara asked. "Enough." Too short an answer. On the second floor, Clara noticed something different. A hallway that didn't appear on the public floor plan of the house. A metal door at the end, contrasting sharply with the rest of the classical architecture. Elliot stopped in front of her. "Private area." He kept his hand on the doorknob for a second longer than necessary, as if testing something, as if evaluating it. Clara slowly raised the camera. "I don't intend to invade your privacy, Mr. Whitmore, but I've received reports of nighttime activity on the property. People coming and going, and not leaving." Silence. His gaze did not waver. "Rumors are food for restless minds. And disappearances are the fuel for investigations. The climate has changed." There was no shouting. There was no explicit threat. Just a barely perceptible change in Elliot's posture. More rigid. "Pay closer attention." He opened the metal door. The atmosphere on the other side didn't match the rest of the mansion. It was a clinical corridor. Light-colored walls, intense white lighting, a subtle smell of disinfectant. Finally, a larger room. Tables, medical equipment. Not hospital grade, but sophisticated. "Social project," he said. "Biomedical research funded by the family. Experimental treatments for degenerative diseases." Clara photographed everything. "And what about the volunteers? They signed consent forms." She walked over to one of the tables. There were discrete marks of containment on the metal sides. Scratches. Deep. Their eyes met. He did not deviate. "Desperate people take risks," he said, "and risks save lives." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't illegal to conduct private research with consent. Unofficially. But something was wrong. Very wrong. While adjusting the camera's focus, he heard a sound, an impact, stuffy, coming from behind a side door. Elliot's expression closed. Old equipment. The sound came back, stronger. It wasn't equipment. It was someone. Clara lowered the camera slowly. She didn't know exactly what was going on in that mansion, but he knew that the walls weren't there to protect the Whitmore family from the world. They were there to protect the world from what was happening inside. And at that moment, he realized that perhaps he had entered a place from which he would not leave so easily. Clara left the clinical wing with the same controlled demeanor she had maintained since the beginning of the visit. She didn't confront him. She didn't insist. He only photographed neutral details, old books in the library, European sculptures, the view of the internal gardens. But something was out of proportion. Whitmore Manor was located on the outskirts of Hartford, Connecticut, a region marked by historical wealth, old industrial fortunes, and traditional families who had maintained political and economic influence for generations. It was the kind of place where surnames were worth more than diplomas. Whitmore was one of those surnames. The fortune began in the early 20th century with railway investments and later shifted to the hospital infrastructure sector. During World War II, the family supplied medical equipment to the government. Decades later, it expanded into private biomedical research funds. Always close to medicine, always close to hospitals. Clara had already researched this before arriving. What was missing from public records were the dozens of small companies registered under anonymous subsidiaries, all related to private clinical trials. As Elliot guided her back to the main lobby, Clara observed human details that contrasted with the coldness of the medical wing. There were marks on the stair railing, recent scratches, inconsistent with normal use. One of the Persian rugs had an almost invisible stain, hastily cleaned, and in the air, besides the faint smell of disinfectant, there was something metallic. Blood doesn't have a strong smell when cleaned up quickly, but it leaves traces. "My father believed in scientific advancement above all else," Elliot commented as they walked. "He said that progress requires sacrifice." It wasn't a casual comment. It was a philosophy. "Does your father still live here?" Clara asked. "Live?" But he didn't specify where. He didn't even call for him. He didn't even introduce it. As they walked through a smaller room, Clara noticed something curious. An entire wall covered with physical files, folders organized by year. It wasn't common for someone with so many resources to keep printed documents. Physical control is more difficult to break into. Elliot noticed her interest. Some information should not exist in digital clouds, another philosophy. Outside, the back garden was far too spacious for a typical residence. There was a small greenhouse, an enclosed shed, and a stone path leading to a secondary building, almost invisible among the bare autumn trees. "Is that structure also part of the project?" Clara pointed out. "Storage, quick response." She took the picture anyway. As they walked around the property, 2 employees finally appeared. A young gardener, downcast, with mechanical movements, and a middle-aged woman in a discreet uniform who avoided eye contact. None of them seemed comfortable. Clara approached the gardener when Elliot stepped away to answer a call. "How long have you worked here?" 3 months. "And do you like it?" He hesitated. "It's work." She noticed a detail, a recent scar on his wrist. Horizontal, thin, almost surgical. Before he could ask any more, Elliot returned. "Miss Bennett, I need you to avoid unauthorized interviews with my team. Control, always in control." Back inside the house, Clara noticed the most unsettling absence. There were no signs of everyday life, no television on, no music, no smell of food. The industrial kitchen was spotless, but cold. It was an inhabited house, but not lived. In the second-floor corridor, as they passed the clinical wing again, Clara noticed a new presence, an elderly man in a wheelchair being pushed by a nurse. Very thin, his skin almost translucent, but their eyes were watching and scared. Elliot stopped immediately. "My father," he said dryly. "Patriarch Whitmore." Clara instinctively raised the camera, but Elliot placed his hand over the lens. No photographs of him. The father tried to say something, but the nurse sped up the chair. For a second, Clara had the impression that the old man's fingers were marked by small, repeated punctures, as if he had been subjected to frequent blood draws, or something worse. "Does he participate in the studies?" Clara asked. "He is their reason for being. That answer is too ambiguous." In Elliot's private office, Clara finally found the contrast she was looking for. A mural of old news articles about medical advances sponsored by the Whitmores. Clippings from local newspapers celebrating promising discoveries. But no final result has been proven. Always in the experimental phase. Always under development. Never completed. She then noticed the pattern. The volunteers came from vulnerable backgrounds, people without robust health insurance, temporary workers, young people in debt. The promise was free treatment, financial compensation, and anonymity. And then what? They disappeared from the records. "Science needs pioneers," Elliot said, approaching silently. "People willing to face the unknown." Clara turned to him. "And what happens when the unknown wins?" He held her gaze. "Not all progress is beautiful." Outside, the sky darkened. The shadows of the mansion stretched across the lawn like distorted fingers. And at that moment, Clara understood something essential. This wasn't just about money. It was an obsession. Obsession with prolonging life. Obsession with overcoming the degeneration that was consuming the patriarch. Obsession with controlling the inevitable. But there was something even more disturbing. If the studies were failing, why did the Whitmores continue? And where were the bodies of those who did not survive the necessary risks? The muffled sound she had heard earlier echoed in her memory. It wasn't equipment. It was resistance. And perhaps there was still someone alive behind those metal doors. Clara did not leave the mansion immediately. He invented the need to capture outdoor images at dusk. Natural light, architectural contrast, plausible technical justifications. Elliot allowed it, but maintained visual distance. He never lost sight of her. The Connecticut sky was bathed in shades of blue-gray, and the bare trees cast distorted shadows on the walls, which were too high to be merely decorative. Clara walked slowly, but her eyes were alert. The secondary building at the back of the property now seemed more significant than before. Small, unassuming, with windows too high to allow any view inside. No sign, no identification. Storage, he had said. She adjusted the telephoto lens and zoomed in on the side of the structure. There was an underground entrance, hidden by the uneven terrain. It was not listed on any public map. While taking photographs, he heard the sound again. This time it wasn't stuffy. It was a scream, short, interrupted. She froze. The sound came from the secondary structure, not from the main clinical wing. Elliot appeared beside her almost instantly. "What are you photographing?" "Exterior architecture." He followed the direction of the lens. The silence between the two became denser than the cold night air. "That area is not part of the tour," he said. "It didn't seem to be included in the social project." He took a step forward. "Miss Bennett, your credentials are for institutional documentation, not for private investigation." She maintained a firm posture. "People are disappearing in this region." He tilted his head slightly. "People are disappearing everywhere." It wasn't denial. It was normalization. Clara then noticed something new. The main gate was closed, locked. The rental car was still inside. "It's already dark," Elliot added. "It's not safe to drive around here at night." That wasn't a concern. It was a matter of restraint. The young gardener reappeared near the greenhouse. His movements were more tense now. He glanced quickly at Clara and then at Elliot. There was fear there. Disobedience. Clara made an impulsive decision. He walked directly towards the secondary building. "Miss Bennett." She ignored it. The pace of the footsteps behind her quickened. When he reached the side door, which was partially hidden by the grounds, he realized it was unlocked. Error or trap. She opened it. The smell hit her first. It wasn't just disinfectant, it was iron, fresh blood. The interior was different from the main clinical wing. Less organized, more improvised, medical equipment connected to independent generators. Stretchers lined up, plastic curtains separating areas, and 3 of them were occupied. 2 unconscious men, and a woman is awake. Orders, with electrodes attached to the chest. The woman's eyes met Clara's. There was panic and a plea. Clara instinctively raised her camera, recording everything in quick succession. Evidence, faces, equipment, serial numbers. "That's trespassing." Elliot's voice echoed behind her. But something was different now, without the mask of cordiality. Cold, controlled. Dangerous. "Did they consent?" Clara asked, holding the camera between them as a barrier. "They signed. Under what conditions?" He didn't answer. The woman on the stretcher began to struggle. The monitors triggered audible alerts. One of the unconscious men had a mild seizure. Elliot walked over to a panel and switched off one of the devices. The monitor stabilized, but the silence that followed was worse. "We're close to a breakthrough," he said, as if discussing an academic thesis. "My father can't die." Clara understood. It wasn't just research, it was a transfer, compatibility tests, repeated attempts to extract something, cells, tissues, perhaps bone marrow, perhaps blood in extreme volumes, to prolong the patriarch's life, without official protocols, without supervision, without ethical limits. "They are not volunteers," Clara said. "They are necessary." The word echoed, necessary. The gardener appeared in the doorway, breathless. "Mr. Whitmore, he's awake." "Which he, the father, or another patient?" Elliot hesitated. That was the first sign of a crack. "Lock her in here," he said to the gardener, referring to Clara. The young man turned pale. I can't." Elliot approached him slowly. "You've already received an advance payment. You've already signed a confidentiality agreement. You've already participated." He participated. The word fell like a weight. Clara then realized the employees were not just workers. They were forced accomplices, or coerced. The gardener looked at Clara, then to the tied-up woman, then to Elliot. Something broke inside him. He pulled the main power cable from the panel. The lights flickered. The monitors turned off. Alarms began to sound in different parts of the building. Elliot moved forward to grab him, but Clara seized the moment. He ran to the bound woman and began to untie her restraints. "Can you walk?" he asked, cutting the strips with a scalpel on the table. The woman nodded, trembling. Footsteps echoed down the outside corridor. More people, security guards who had not been seen before. The conflict was no longer implicit. Now it was physical, concrete. Clara handed the camera to the woman. "If I don't leave here, take this to the police." "And you?" "I still need more proof." Elliot regained his balance and pulled a device from his pocket. It wasn't a weapon. It was a remote control. On the ceiling, metal doors began to descend slowly, isolating sections of the structure. Internal containment system. Clara realized it too late. She had entered a clandestine laboratory designed to never allow outside witnesses. And now the exits were being sealed. The gardener pulled Clara by the arm. "There's another way out. An old basement, but it can only be opened manually." The alarms were ringing. Footsteps were drawing closer. The newly freed woman was trying to stay on her feet. Elliot watched everything with an expression that wasn't anger. It was calculation. He still believed he could control the situation, but something essential had changed. Clara was no longer just a curious photographer. She was a variable outside the experiment, and for the first time, the mansion's walls didn't seem enough to contain what was about to explode. The old basement was not part of the mansion's modern design. It predates the renovation of the clinical wing. It predates the biomedical research by a considerable amount. As the alarms blared and the metal doors descended sector by sector, the gardener, who finally said his name was Daniel, led Clara and the newly freed woman through a narrow side corridor, hidden behind false panels. The passageway was old. Exposed bricks, accumulated dust, makeshift wiring connecting the past to the present. "That was a Cold War-era shelter," Daniel whispered, walking quickly. "His father built it. He was always afraid of losing control." Control. The word kept returning like a sickly refrain. The woman, still trembling, said her name was Megan. She had agreed to participate in an experimental program for the treatment of an autoimmune disease. They promised upfront payment, lifetime medical coverage, and confidentiality. "At first it was just tests," she said, breathless. "Then the transfusions started, absurd amounts, and something else. They extracted bone marrow, repeatedly." She swallowed hard. "I overheard conversations. They were trying to stabilize his father's body, transfer regenerative factors, test for extreme compatibility." Clara took photographs as she walked. She documented the clandestine structure, the makeshift installations, the numbers on the boxes, the lots of equipment. Each click of the camera was a weapon against the silence. But the conflict wasn't just physical. Another layer was emerging. As they made their way through the basement, Clara found a room locked with an old padlock. Daniel hesitated. "It's not part of the laboratory," he said. She forced the padlock open with a rusty metal bar. The door gave way. The interior was unlike anything else. He wasn't a doctor. It was domestic. An old bedroom, an iron bed, a writing desk, shelves filled with schoolbooks dating from the 1990s, photographs stored inside a box. Photographs of a girl, always inside the mansion, always alone. Clara turned one of the photos over. On the back, handwritten, "Eleanor, 1998. "Who is she?" Clara asked. Daniel turned pale. "The sister?" Clara froze. "Does Elliot have a sister?" He had. Megan stopped breathing for a second. Daniel continued, his voice faltering. "Officially, he died at 17, domestic accident. But nobody saw the body. There was never an open funeral." Clara looked at the room again. There were marks on the wall, small ones, sequential, as if someone had counted the days. The clandestine laboratory wasn't the mansion's first secret. It was just the latest one. Footsteps echoed in the tunnel, closer now. Elliot was not alone. Time pressure was mounting. There was no time to digest the discoveries. But Clara was already connecting the dots. If Father Whitmore always had an obsession with control, if he was always involved in medical experimentation, if a daughter died on his own property, what had really happened there decades before? They resumed their escape through the tunnel. The air was becoming thinner. The passage sloped slightly upward. "The basement connects to the outer shed," Daniel said, "but the exit is manual. The door is heavy. It takes a while to open." Alarms still echoed in the distance, but now mixed with male voices organizing searches. Megan tripped. Clara held it. "Can you do it?" "With you." But her face was getting paler and paler. The excessive transfusions had already taken their toll. Upon reaching the exit door, they realized it was locked from the inside with an old rotating mechanism. Daniel began to force it open. Nothing. "You need 2 people," he said. Clara put down the camera for a moment and helped. The metal was creaking too loudly. Time is running out. As they forced their way through, Megan looked at Clara. "Did you know that he tests for extreme genetic compatibility?" she asked, her voice weak. Clara paused for a second. "What do you mean?" "They're not random volunteers. They cross-reference genetic data beforehand. They look for specific patterns, rare markers." Daniel froze. "I had a saliva sample taken when I was hired," he muttered. Heavy silence. Clara felt her stomach churn. It wasn't just scientific desperation. It was a selection process, choice, as if they were searching for something very specific, a genetic profile that might exist within the family itself. The door finally gave way with a metallic snap. Cold air rushed into the tunnel, but when they emerged into the outer shed, they realized they were not alone. 2 men were waiting there, private security guards, no formal uniform, just practiced posture. And behind them, standing at the entrance to the newly opened tunnel, was Elliot. "No rush, without raising your voice." "You don't understand," he said. "We're close to correcting a mistake that started 30 years ago." Clara felt the weight of the impending revelation. Error, 30 years. Eleanor. The main conflict, saving his father at all costs, was now intertwined with an even darker subplot. Something had happened in that mansion in the past. Something that required biological correction. Perhaps the patriarch's illness was not natural. Perhaps it was the consequence of an old experiment. And perhaps Eleanor was the first test. Megan almost fainted. Daniel positioned himself in front of them, but he was clearly torn between fear and guilt. "I didn't know it was like this," he said to Elliot. "You said you were a volunteer." "They are," Elliot replied, "just like you were." The tension was now total. No weapons visible, no shouting, but with lives hanging in the balance because of decisions made in seconds. Clara knew she had to choose. To flee immediately, leaving behind the chance to discover what really happened to Eleanor, or confront Elliot right there, pressuring him to reveal his past, buying time, perhaps creating enough of a distraction for Megan to escape. The walls of the mansion remained high. But now, what was about to collapse was not concrete. It was a secret kept for 3 decades. Clara didn't run. If I ran away now, I would leave with enough evidence to start an investigation. But something bigger was about to emerge. Something that explained not only the current experiments, but the very origin of that obsession. She took a step forward. "What was the mistake, Elliot?" The security guards held their positions, but awaited his command. Elliot tilted his head slightly, as if deciding whether it was worth continuing to pretend. Then he did something unexpected. He ordered the security guards to step back. "Bring my father here," he said calmly. Daniel's eyes widened. "He can't leave the medical ward," he murmured. "He can," Elliot replied. "He needs to see this." Minutes later, Patriarch Whitmore was brought in on an improvised motorized wheelchair connected to portable IV bags. His skin was even paler under the cold light of the shed. But his eyes were completely lucid. There was no dementia, there was no confusion, there was awareness and guilt. Clara felt the weight of the change at that moment. The man was not merely a frail patient being kept artificially alive. He was involved. Tell her, Elliot said, positioning himself behind his father's chair. Tell her why we need to continue. Old Whitmore breathed heavily. Each word seemed to be forced out of him. Eleanor, he began. The name echoed through the warehouse like a gunshot. Megan gripped Clara's arm tightly. Eleanor wasn't sick, the old man continued. We made her sick. Absolute silence. Clara felt the world rearrange itself inside her own head. Explain, she demanded. Elliot closed his eyes for a second. There was no shame in it. It was exhaustion. My sister had a rare genetic profile, he said. Above-average cellular regeneration capacity. We discovered it by chance, during routine exams. My father saw scientific potential. I was 12 years old. The old man gripped the arms of the chair tightly, his knuckles almost transparent. We did small tests, minimal extractions. She trusted us. His voice broke for the first time. But the body began to react. Internal rejection, immune collapse. We tried to correct it. We intensified the procedures. Clara felt her stomach churn. You killed her. We dismantled it, Elliot corrected coldly. The word was worse than any scream. We tried to stabilize her genetic pattern outside of her body, he continued. We couldn't. We lost everything. Daniel took a step back. Then why continue? Clara asked. That was the real turning point. Elliot looked at his father, and the father replied, because it wasn't a genetic defect, the old man said with effort. It was a flaw in the application process. Clara understood even before he finished. They believed the mistake wasn't in the idea. I was in the process of being executed. Since then, Elliot continued, we've been looking for individuals with compatible patterns, people with markers similar to hers. We're refining the process, learning. Refining it? Megan whispered, horrified. We're close, Elliot insisted. We've managed to stabilize tissues for longer periods. My father is alive because of it. Clara looked at the patriarch again. It was not a natural extension. It was forced maintenance, a body sustained by constant interventions. And then came the final revelation. Eleanor didn't die in the first phase, the old man said, almost inaudibly. Clara froze. What do you mean? Silence. Elliot did not respond immediately, but his gaze betrayed something that wasn't coldness. It was contained pain. She survived for months, he said finally, unstable, altered, her body trying to rebuild itself while failing. Clara felt the air escape her lungs. Where is she? The old man closed his eyes, not like someone who avoids answering, but like someone who is revived. Elliot slowly pointed to the floor of the shed. Below the main clinical wing, there is a level that does not appear on any plan. The impact was physical. It wasn't just a clandestine laboratory. There was something, or someone, that had been maintained for 30 years. She didn't survive, Elliot said too quickly. Not entirely, the father corrected. The silence that followed was absolute. Megan began to cry silently. Daniel murmured an almost inaudible, "My God." Clara felt the story slipping out of journalistic control and entering morally unbearable territory. Are you still testing people? Trying to recreate what you did to her? Clara asked. To correct it, Elliot replied. To bring her back, Daniel whispered. Old Whitmore finally opened his eyes again, and there was something there that Clara recognized immediately. It wasn't ambition. It wasn't scientific obsession. It was fear. Because she still answers, he said. The world seemed to tilt. Answer me, Clara repeated. Elliot took a deep breath. Electrical stimuli, certain genetic patterns trigger activity. Not cognitive activity, but a biological response. Megan began to back away. You kept... What? She asked, her voice faltering. Clara felt the overwhelming weight of the revelation. It wasn't just about saving the father. It was about keeping alive, in a fragmented, experimental, grotesque way, the daughter they had destroyed. And all the volunteers, were disposable pieces in an attempt to replicate a genetic code that had been lost, the scream she had heard earlier. Perhaps it didn't come from the current patients. Perhaps it stemmed from something deeper, older, something that shouldn't exist. And at that moment, Clara realized that she wasn't just facing a medical scandal. I was faced with an irreversible choice. Expose everything immediately, alerting the authorities and eliminating any chance of discovering what was really under the mansion. Or descend to the hidden level and record the final proof. Because if Eleanor was still responding... So the walls of the mansion weren't just hiding illegal experiments. They were hiding 30 years of a mistake that was never truly buried. The silence following the revelation was more disturbing than any previous alarm. The cold wind blew through the cracks in the shed, but no one moved. Clara was the first to act. He picked up the camera from the floor and quickly reviewed the captured images, the patients, the equipment, the implicit confessions. Then he pointed the lens directly at Elliot and his father. "Repeat it," she said. "It wasn't requested. It was a record." Old Whitmore seemed to shrink in his chair. Elliot, on the other hand, straightened his posture. "You don't understand what's at stake," he replied. "I understand perfectly," Clara retorted. "Kidnapping, illegal human experimentation, concealment of death, genetic manipulation without federal authorization. Do you want me to continue?" Daniel took 2 steps back, clearly on the verge of collapse. I didn't know about my sister, but I knew about the tests," Clara interrupted without looking at him. He lowered his head. Guilt spread like a second layer of tension in the atmosphere. Megan, still weak, leaned against a metal wall. Her eyes were fixed on the patriarch. "Is she in pain?" he asked, almost in a whisper. The question was more devastating than any accusation. Old Whitmore did not answer immediately. Elliot answered for him. "There is no organized cortical activity." "That's not what I asked," Megan insisted. Silence. The old man finally spoke. "Sometimes there are irregular power surges." Clara felt the physical impact of the response. They didn't know, or they knew and chose to ignore it. Outside, sirens began to echo in the distance. They all froze. Daniel raised his head, startled. "I didn't call anyone," he said. Clara didn't either. Then she understood. Before entering the secondary structure, he had discreetly activated an automatic data transmission from the camera to a secure server, a protocol he used in high-risk investigations. If the signal were abruptly interrupted, a partial copy would be sent to a journalistic contact in Boston. Perhaps the alarm had already been raised. Elliot noticed the sound of the sirens as well, but surprisingly, he didn't panic. He looked at his father, and the father nodded almost imperceptibly. A silent decision was made between them. "Get down," Elliot ordered the security guards, not as a threat, but as a priority. Clara understood immediately. They had no intention of running away. They intended to protect what was hidden. "Don't you dare," she said, taking a step forward. "Do you want the whole truth?" Elliot asked, staring at her with unexpected intensity. "Then come and see." The proposal came as a heavy burden. Megan shook her head, terrified. "Don't go." Daniel seemed torn between running out of the warehouse and disappearing from it all, or staying and facing the consequences. The sirens were closer now, but not yet inside the property. The high walls would delay entry. Elliot began moving his father's chair toward the tunnel back to the medical ward. "If the police go in without understanding what's down there, they'll shut everything down," he said. "And if there's any residual activity, it'll die out completely." They still treated it as a gift. Clara felt the moral tension closing in around her. If it went down, it would be temporarily delaying the official shutdown. If he didn't go down, he might never record the final proof. "You're manipulating the situation," she said. "No, I'm offering a choice," Elliot replied. The security guards awaited instructions, but did not move against Clara. There was something strange there. It wasn't just about protecting a secret. It was a desperate need for validation, as a witness, for someone to confirm that 30 years of horror had not been entirely in vain. Megan began to slide slowly towards the floor. Daniel caught her. "She needs to be in the hospital," he said urgently. Clara made the decision. "Get her out of here," he ordered Daniel. "Take her to the gate. If the police are outside, hand everything over." She handed him the camera's secondary memory card. "If I'm not out in 10 minutes, hand this over immediately." Daniel hesitated. Then he nodded. His eyes were filled with fear, but also something new, courage too late. Clara turned to Elliot. "I'm going downstairs, but any attempt to stop me from leaving with what I've recorded, and everything will be made public." Elliot didn't argue. Old Whitmore seemed too exhausted for anything. As they returned through the tunnel, the sirens finally echoed inside the property, gates being forced open. Orders shouted from a distance. Time is running out, but for the first time since entering the mansion, Clara sensed that the power was beginning to shift. Not for her, but for the truth. Whatever had been preserved beneath that house for 30 years was about to cease being a secret, and the consequences would not be merely legal, they would be historic, because if Eleanor was still responding, so the Whitmore's mistake was never truly over, it had only been kept breathing. Access to the hidden level was located beneath the main clinical wing. There were no visible buttons, no modern electronic panels, just a hydraulic platform camouflaged under the metal floor, operated by a manual mechanism hidden behind a medicine cabinet. Absolute control, no digital records, without a trace. As Elliot turned the mechanism, Clara realized something crucial. He wasn't trying to stop her, he was trying to prove something. The platform began to descend slowly. The sound of the sirens above was now muffled by the thick concrete. The outside world seemed too distant. Down there the air was different. It's colder, denser. The walls were lined with insulating material, not hospital-grade, industrial, old, as if that space had been adapted countless times over the decades. In the center of the room, there was a unique structure. A vertical cylindrical capsule surrounded by cables, monitors and circulation pumps. It wasn't futuristic, it was improvised. And inside it was a silhouette. Clara didn't pick up the camera immediately. She approached first. I needed to see it. I needed to understand. The liquid inside the capsule was translucent, slightly cloudy. Tubes went in and out at multiple points. The body inside was partially visible. It wasn't intact. Scars crisscrossed his arms and torso, reconstructed areas. Others are stunted. But the face still had human features, preserved. Elliot stopped beside the capsule. The mask of coldness finally gave way. "She was 17, he said, his voice lower than Clara had ever heard. Old Whitmore closed his eyes, unable to bear the sight. Clara felt the emotional impact hit her differently now. Up until then, she had been an investigator, observer, documentalist. But there was something there that required more than just documentation. It demanded a stance. She raised the camera. He started taking photographs, technical details, connections, the body. "The monitors. Is there any activity?" she asked firmly. Elliot pointed to one of the graphs. Irregular lines, sporadic peaks. "Electrical stimulation when we introduce compatible markers," he explained. "Attempts at tissue regeneration, specific immunological reactions." Clara realized what he was really saying. They weren't trying to bring her back as a person. They were trying to recover the biological capacity they believed they had lost. And her body had become a permanent receptacle for experimentation. "She's no longer your sister," Clara said, finally looking him in the eye. "She's your victim." The sentence hit Elliot like a physical blow, but he did not react aggressively. He reacted with something unexpected, doubt. The distant sound of doors being forced open echoed above them. "Time is almost up." Clara took another step forward with the capsule. Her own fears were there, weighing on her. Fear of legal repercussions, fear of not getting out alive, fear that the evidence would be destroyed. But something bigger was emerging. She couldn't just expose it. I needed to interrupt. "Turn it off," she said. Elliot didn't move. "If the police shut down abruptly, there could be a systemic collapse," he argued. "You don't know that," Clara replied. "You never knew. You just kept trying." Old Whitmore began to tremble slightly in his chair. "We couldn't let her die again," he murmured. Clara turned to him. "She's already dead." Absolute silence. The words weren't cruel. They were inevitable. Clara's growth at that time did not stem from impulsive courage. It came from clarity. She wasn't there just to expose a crime. I was there to stop it from continuing. She began disconnecting the external monitoring cables, those that wouldn't directly affect immediate circulation, but which powered the additional experimental systems. Elliot stepped forward. It stopped. The sirens were now inside the mansion. Voices shouted orders. "If you do that," he said, "everything we've tried will be lost." Clara didn't stop. "That's exactly the goal." She pressed the deactivation button for the secondary experimental module. One of the monitors turned off. The irregular lines have decreased. Nothing dramatic happened. No seizures, no alarm, only minimal stability. Elliot watched, his breathing quickening. For the first time in 30 years, someone was bringing the cycle to a close. Not angrily, but decisively. Clara looked again at the body inside the capsule, and he felt something he didn't expect. Not horror. More cooked, a delayed grief that family had never allowed themselves to feel. "Let her rest," she said more gently. Old Whitmore began to cry. "I am here," without theatricality. Only silent tears streaming down a face consumed by its own obsession. Elliot stood motionless. His transformation was not complete, but a crack had opened up. The scientific obsession was being confronted by its human consequences. Footsteps echoed on the stairs. Lantern beams swept down the hallway above. The police had reached the main level. Clara took the last photographs. Then he lowered the camera. She was no longer just the professional who entered that mansion looking for a sensational story. She was the person who decided to break a 30-year cycle. And in doing so, she knew that her life would change as well, because the story she carried now was not just macabre, it was historic. And the decision he had made down there would define everything that would follow. The lanterns streaked across the upper corridor like blades of light, cutting through decades of accumulated darkness. "Connecticut Police!" the voice echoed firmly, authoritatively. Clara heard the metallic sound of boots descending the stairs that led to the hidden level. Elliot did not run away. Old Whitmore didn't ask to go up either. The capsule continued to operate only in minimum sustain mode, now silent, without the additional experimental modules. The cycle was broken, but it's not over yet. 2 police officers appeared at the entrance to the underground room, their weapons lowered as they realized there was no physical confrontation underway. Behind them, paramedics and federal public health agents began to descend. Clara slowly raised her hands, identifying herself. "I am an investigative journalist. I have documented evidence. There are victims above in the secondary laboratory." The police quickly cordoned off the area. Elliot was handcuffed without resistance. Elder Whitmore was removed from the chair and transferred to a medical stretcher under custody. But before being taken away, he looked one last time at the capsule, not as a scientist, as a father. That was the first time Clara had seen real remorse. As the operation expanded throughout the mansion, agents sealed doors, collected equipment, and shut off additional power systems. Technicians assessed the stability of the capsule and discussed protocols for the safe removal of the preserved body. Nothing there could be switched off abruptly. The revelation required caution. Outside, ambulances attended to Megan and the other patients found in the secondary structure. Daniel sat on the sidewalk, his hands trembling, giving his statement. Clara left the underground wing, escorted by a detective. The cold night air hit his face like a shock of reality. The walls of the mansion were now illuminated by flashing red and blue lights. Reporters began to gather outside, alerted by police broadcasts and unusual activity. The secret was no longer contained, but there was still some lingering tension. One detail that could change everything. As she handed the main memory card to the detective in charge, Clara asked a crucial question. Did they have federal authorization for advanced genetic research? The detective frowned. Not that we know of. She took a deep breath. Then, check the medical foundations associated with the family. There are registered subsidiaries. They may have partial legal coverage. That wasn't paranoia. It was a strategy. The Whitmores had decades of influence. Lawyers would be contacted within minutes. Narratives would be constructed. Experimental research. Voluntary consent. Scientific error, not a crime. The preparation for climax was no longer physical. It was institutional. Clara stepped away from the commotion and called her contact in Boston. "Is everything on the server?" he asked. "We received part of the automatic upload," the voice replied from the other end, but the signal dropped halfway through. Clara looked at the mansion. "I have the rest." A brief silence. "Do you understand what this means?" She understood. It wasn't just sensationalist news. It was a national medical scandal, possible legal precedent, ethical issues regarding biological preservation, consent, and human experimentation outside the regulated system. And there was still the central question: what to do with Eleanor? She was no ordinary patient. She wasn't alive in the conventional sense, but she wasn't officially dead either. If the state were to shut down the system, it would be considered the end of life support. If they continued, it would be perpetuating an experiment. The case went beyond the criminal sphere. It was entering extreme bioethical territory. One of the federal agents approached Clara. "We will need your formal statement." "I'll be available," she replied. "But first, I needed to secure something." She walked to the ambulance where old Whitmore was being monitored. A police officer tried to stop her, but she identified herself again. The patriarch opened his eyes as she approached. "You finished her off," he murmured weakly. Clara kept her gaze steady. "No, I put an end to what you were doing to her." He breathed with difficulty. "You don't understand. She was reacting." Clara leaned forward slightly. "Electrical reaction is not life." The ambulance doors slammed shut. The vehicle departed under escort. Elliot was placed in another vehicle. Before going inside, he looked at Clara. There was no hatred. There was something more complex, perhaps relief, perhaps empty, perhaps, for the first time, an absence of purpose. The mansion was beginning to be cordoned off with security tape. Experts came and went. The walls that once protected a secret now marked the boundaries of a historic crime scene. Clara knew that the real climax had not yet happened. He would come to court, regarding the decision about Eleanor. It depends on how society would react to what had been discovered. But there, under the flashing lights and the cold of the early morning, she felt the weight of the choice she had made. There was no turning back. And when that story came to light, the whole country would ask the same question she had asked when she entered: what was hidden behind the walls? Now everyone was about to find out. The news broke before dawn. Helicopters flew overhead. Broadcast trucks blocked the street. Bioethics experts were urgently summoned to comment on something that no one yet knew how to classify. But the real climax didn't happen in front of the cameras. It happened 36 hours later, not Hartford Federal Court. The government had requested emergency authorization to assume medical control of the underground structure and decide on the continuation or termination of Eleanor Whitmore's biological support. The family's defense argued that the capsule constituted continuous life support for a patient not legally declared dead. The prosecution argued that this constituted the illegal experimental preservation of human tissue without valid consent. The judge requested expert testimony, and Clara was called. She wasn't a doctor, but he was the only civilian witness who had seen the system actively operating and the experimental modules being shut down. Upon entering the room, he saw Elliot sitting next to the lawyers. No handcuffs, simple suit, sunken, exhausted eyes. Old Whitmore was not present. He remained hospitalized under custody. Clara took the oath. The questions started out technical. What did you see? What was turned off? Was there instability after the interruption? She answered precisely, without dramatizing, without exaggerating. Then came the central question. Do you believe there was conscious activity in the preserved body? Absolute silence in the room. Clara took a deep breath. He thought about the capsule, along irregular lines, during power surges. He also thought about the word Elliot had used, answer. No, he replied firmly. There was residual biological activity. There was no evidence of consciousness. The defense tried to intervene. Are you a neurologist? No. So your opinion is speculative. Clara kept her gaze fixed on the judge. My statement is not a clinical opinion. It is a factual observation. There was no organized cortical activity on the monitors displayed. The court then requested that one of the federal experts confirm the data collected after the seizure of the mansion. The expert was direct. The structure maintained artificial circulation and sporadic electrical stimulation. There have been no signs of integrated brain function for at least decades. Decades. The word echoed like a moral pronouncement. Elliot closed his eyes, not in denial, but it's like finally hearing something you've always known. The judge asked the final, crucial question. Is there any medical justification for keeping the system active? The expert hesitated for only a second. No, Your Excellency. The silence that followed was the true climax. There were no screams. There was no dramatic collapse. A decision was made. The court authorized the permanent disconnection from the biological support system under medical supervision and with full documentation. No further experimentation, no continuity. Without exception. Elliot did not protest. That was the most unexpected thing. When the judge concluded the session, he stood up slowly. He looked at Clara one last time, and he spoke, in a voice low enough for only her to hear as he passed by her under escort. I really thought I was saving something. Clara did not respond immediately, because that was the final emotional twist. He wasn't just a villain, it was the product of a mistake that he refused to accept. But that did not absolve him. Hours later, at the university hospital under federal custody, doctors shut down the system. Without a public ceremony, no press, the capsule was opened for the first time in 30 years. There was no final electrical reaction. There was no biological miracle. There was no hidden signal. Just utter silence. The real ending wasn't grotesque. It was simple. And that was the most devastating thing of all. Clara followed the proceedings from a distance, authorized as an observer of the legal process. When he left the hospital that night, he felt something different from the fear he had felt when entering the mansion days before. He felt a weight, but also clarity. She had not only exposed a crime, a 30-year cycle had come to an end. And in doing so, something within himself had changed. Initially, I was looking for evidence. In the end, he took responsibility. The story that began as a macabre investigation became a confrontation between obsession and acceptance. And in that court, it wasn't just the system that was shut down. It was the illusion that scientific progress justifies any sacrifice. Whitmore Mansion remained isolated for months. Federal experts searched every inch of the property. Equipment was catalogued, financial records seized, and contracts analyzed line by line. Medical foundations linked to the family were suspended preventively, while investigations broadened the scope of the case. The scandal became a national issue. Television programs debated scientific ethics. Universities organized emergency symposia on the limits of genetic research. Congress began discussions about regulatory loopholes in private experiments funded by family fortunes. But beyond the public spectacle, There were quieter human consequences. Megan survived. After weeks in the hospital, she filed a civil lawsuit against the Whitmore family. Other survivors were identified. Some would bear permanent physical consequences: immunological damage, bone scarring, psychological trauma difficult to quantify. Daniel accepted a plea deal in exchange for full cooperation with the authorities. His testimony helped to chronologically reconstruct the last 5 years of clandestine experimentation. He was not morally exonerated, but neither was he treated as the architect of the horror. He was just another weak link in a chain of manipulation. Elliot faced federal charges of kidnapping, illegal human experimentation, fraud, and obstruction of justice. During the formal trial, he maintained a restrained demeanor. He did not attempt to portray himself as an unappreciated genius or a victim of circumstances. When given the chance to speak, he simply said, "We believed we would correct the initial mistake. We didn't accept that the mistake was the attempt itself." Old Whitmore was never convicted. His health deteriorated rapidly after the system was permanently shut down. He died in hospital custody before the formal closure of the case. There was no public funeral. There were no tributes. The mansion was confiscated by the government. Part of the property would be transformed into a regulated research center under university supervision as a symbol of ethical reform. Another part would remain closed off as a memorial to the unidentified victims. Eleanor Whitmore. After legal examinations and definitive confirmation of the absence of brain activity, she was officially declared dead 30 years late. His burial took place in a private ceremony without the press. Clara showed up, not as a journalist, but as a witness to the end. The gravestone was simple, just the name and dates, 1981-1998. The truth has been restored to its proper time. In the following months, the story published by Clara became one of the most impactful investigations of the decade. It wasn't sensationalist. It didn't exploit the grotesque. It was factual. It needs ruthless. She described what she saw, the decisions made, the human consequences. But he omitted one personal detail: the moment he chose to turn off the experimental module. He wasn't seeking the spotlight. I knew that the real closure wasn't in court or in the headlines. It was in that silent decision beneath the concrete. History changed his career. She began to be invited to debates on investigative ethics, bioethics, and the responsibility of the press in extreme scientific cases. But the most profound impact was internal. Before Whitmore Manor, Clara believed her role was to reveal. Later he understood that revealing information also implies intervening when the moral line is crossed. She didn't romanticize what she had done. He knew that others might argue that he interrupted an experiment that theoretically could have led to medical advancement. But I also knew that progress built on destroyed lives is not advancement. It's repeating the same mistake. The last time he passed by the street where the mansion was still surrounded, the walls were already being partially demolished. Concrete cracking, herras arrancadas. The structure that had concealed obsession for decades was now exposed to the open air, and Clara realized something simple. What lay hidden behind those walls was not merely science out of control. It was the human inability to accept loss. And when loss is denied, it transforms into something far more destructive than death itself. A year later, the old Whitmore mansion no longer existed as it once did. Part of the structure was demolished, the basement sealed off, the land divided for new public projects overseen by the state. The high walls disappeared, replaced by transparent fences and open access for the community. Clara returned to the place on a quiet autumn morning. Where there was once oppressive concrete, now there is light. No visible sign of what had been buried there for 3 decades. But she knew. Some stories don't leave physical marks. They leave structural marks on how society comes to perceive its own limitations. As he walked through the former perimeter of the property, his phone vibrated with a notification. New federal legislation had been passed, strengthening oversight of private biomedical research. She observed the empty space where the clinical wing used to be. Sometimes the real horror isn't in what dies, it's in what we insist on not letting die. And, for the first time since she had crossed those gates, Clara felt that something had finally come to an end. Stories like this don't just exist to shock, they exist to make us reflect. How far can science go before losing its humanity? At what point does the desire to save someone transform into an inability to accept loss? And how many times has progress crossed invisible boundaries under the justification of a greater good? If this story has provoked unease, questioning, or outrage in you, share your thoughts. Debate, question, discuss ethics, responsibility, and the limits of human power, because walls that hide mistakes aren't always made of concrete. Sometimes they are made of silence.